Well, big protest movement starting in Iraq in just the past couple of days. People there are pretty fed up with the government. As you know, the government, since the U.S. invaded, and I think what was the year, maybe 2006, they started holding elections. The government's been elected since then, and so there's this sense that the politicians are somewhat accountable to what the voters want. And so when they make campaign promises and then don't follow through on them, people get somewhat upset. And in this case, the protesters who have, there have been a lot of protests against this current Iraqi government. And what kind of ends up happening is, the protests flare up, and then the prime minister comes out and says, hey, I'm going to make all these promises, and we're going to give you all this stuff that you want. And then as soon as the protesters calm down, he goes back to doing exactly what he was doing before. So nothing really happens when these protests happen. So now the protests have sprung up again, and people are angrier because, the prime minister keeps lying to them. And so their basic grievance is that they feel like there's been kind of no recovery since, any of the wars, because there's been a lot of war in Iraq, obviously, over the past, many years. And they don't feel like, the young people don't feel like the country's getting any better. They think that it only gets worse in Iraq. They don't feel like they can get a job, which, in my opinion, you could say that's indirectly the prime minister's fault. But it's not the prime minister's job to get you a job. However, it's very much probably his fault that the conditions are such in Iraq that, there aren't a lot of jobs to be had. And, of course, they're concerned that the government is corrupt, which I would imagine it is quite corrupt. I believe that this post-Saddam Shiite government has been known to have an extensive patronage network, so the corruption charges are probably spot on. Now, this protest movement's quite interesting to me because doesn't seem to be anything that's along ethnic lines. And it seems to be more of a young versus old sort of protest movement. It's much more a generational conflict than it is an ethnic conflict, because there's no real ethnicity problems here at all. I guess ethnicity isn't the right term, but religious, because we would think of in Iraq over the past few years that there was a Sunni versus Shia civil war, which is really what the Iraq war was after the fall of Saddam. It turned into a civil war and the U.S. sided with the Shiites and won. And so these protests are not a resumption of that conflict. This is something entirely new. The Sunnis are not really factors here, because this is happening in the Shiite areas of Iraq. That's where these protests that I'm hearing about them are occurring. It's in Baghdad and Basra and all those sorts of towns. And so the young Shiites just don't feel like the older, Shiite ruling class, represents them particularly well. Now, an interesting divide between the younger and the older Shiites in Iraq that I've noticed is over the issue of Iran. Now, traditionally, or I guess in the last few years, we've kind of thought, at least some of us who are skeptics of American foreign policy have seen the Iraq War as a way of shifting, Iraq from a Sunni state to a, Shia, i.e., Iran-friendly state. Which is true. The current Iraqi government's very close with Iran, because many of the Iraqi Shiite leaders who came back to win the elections after Saddam was overthrown were actually exiled in Iran for multiple decades because they sided with Iran in the Iran-Iraq war, because they didn't like Saddam, because he was a Sunni, and they were part of the Shia majority, and they wanted their people to rise up. And so they sided with Iran because they were hoping Iran would win the war, overthrow Saddam, and then install them as the leaders. And it turns out that it wasn't Iran who eventually overthrew Saddam, it was the Americans. And so they came back to lead Iraq. And that's, the people who you have running the country now. These are essentially, people who are, let's say they're more Shiite than they are Iraqi. They don't really have an Iraqi identity. And so we've seen a lot of, in these protests, at least from what I've been able to see, because, again, a lot of this stuff is getting censored, and I'll get to that. It's hard to get information out of Iraq right now, but I've seen people who are wary of the Iran-Iraq relationship, that they don't like all that Iranian influence in their government. They want a government that is focused only on, the domestic people, not, people to the east. And that's why, we saw a bunch of protesters earlier this year burn down the Iranian consulate in Basra. And these are Shiite protesters. So again, this is not a sectarian conflict. These are Shiites who just don't like Iran having influence in their country. Now, getting back to the events of the protests themselves, things apparently got quite violent very quickly. The Iraqi government did, in fact, send in the tanks very quickly. There were protests going on, most notably in Baghdad, and I did not messing up here. This is actually what it's called, Tahrir Square. Yes, the same name as the square in Egypt where all the protests happened against, Hosni Mubarak. I don't know if what the name Tahrir means or what the significance is. I'm not sure if there are a lot of cities with, so-called Tahrir squares in the Middle East. Perhaps there is, but I just kind of find that to be a funny coincidence. Now, after the Iraqi government sent in the troops, and this happened apparently in multiple cities, we're hearing, all across Iraq, but again, we're not able to get too many details out yet, the protesters were apparently shot at, not shots fired in the air, not warning shots. These were shots fired into the crowds, and at least they're saying so far 9 people are killed, but I'm sure it's more than that because we're not able to get great information out of Iraq so far, and I'll get to why that is in a minute. But I just wanted to say, because I've been covering the Hong Kong protests, which also have been, quite popular lately, let's say. And you might notice that I've been quite surprised at how weak, or not weak is the right term, but gentle the Hong Kong police have been with their protesters over there, and how I was surprised that when a guy just got shot just a couple days ago in Hong Kong, I was surprised that it took this long for somebody to get shot, because there have been protests with violent protesters among them going on for quite some time, and the Hong Kong police have not really killed anyone. They haven't been, they've been, if anything, pretty hands off. And I didn't want anybody to get the idea that I was somehow saying that I'm a pro-Chinese sort of commentator. I'm not at all. I'm very much in favor of the anti-Chinese protests. But what I meant is that when you look at protests in most of the world, they tend to end up like they did in Iraq this recently, to where the protesters do end up getting shot, to where the government does send in the tanks and say, keep your mouths shut. The response that we've seen in Iraq to these protests is the exact opposite of what we've seen in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, they're trying, it would seem, to just sort of let the protesters rage and burn themselves out, and not give them that much attention. Whereas in Iraq, these kids are being told to sit down and shut up, and if they don't do as they're told, they will be made to listen. And so essentially, we've just had a sort of Tiananmen Square type situation that has unfolded in Iraq, to where you had this big, of course, less people than in China, because Baghdad's a smaller city and less people in Iraq in general. But you get the point. There was this big protest movement, and it was all centered in this one square in Baghdad, just starting it up. And the Iraqi government caught whiff of that, and they sent in the tanks, shot a bunch of kids, and then tried to destroy the evidence, because apparently the reports we're getting is that they were confiscating the phones of all the witnesses and deleting their videos. And also, before the Iraqi government did this, they were smart and they shut off the internet for the whole country. So nobody could, tweet out videos of the Iraqi government shooting people and killing them, unarmed protesters. Of course, we do have some video, but it's not of any of the worst of what happened from what I saw. And now, of course, I shouldn't act like all the protesters are unarmed, because this is also different from Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, the police don't have as much to worry about as they do in Iraq, because all the people have in Hong Kong are rocks and sticks. They're never going to rise up against the government, unless they just, it's such a mass of people that there's so total disobedience that it becomes impossible for the security forces to quell them without, massacre. But that would take raw numbers. In Iraq, a few people, a small dedicated group of protesters can rise up and attack the government, because people in Iraq, unlike Hong Kong, are armed. I believe it's actually the law in Iraq that the head of a household has to keep a rifle. And even without that law, there's always plenty of weapons floating around Iraq. So people there are armed, and they can resist their government if the government gets out of hand. And we started to see that because there were protesters showing up with guns, and they were getting into fights with the military. Of course, they were greatly outnumbered because the military was all concentrated here. But it is possible, unlike in Hong Kong, I think it is quite possible for these Iraqi protests to erupt into a full revolution. The only problem for that being is that right now, without any internet, I don't think they will know how to organize particularly well, because that's really, once you're armed, the only thing you have to do left then is organize. Because in Hong Kong, they've got one side of it down. They're very good at organizing in Hong Kong. They're very well organized. But, perhaps you could make the case that the Chinese have only allowed the people in Hong Kong to organize because they know that they can't organize. Even if they organize, they're still not particularly strong because they don't have any arms. Whereas in Iraq, they have all the arms, but the government's not letting them organize through the internet. So once word gets out around through Iraq, because of course the information they're trying to stifle it as best they can, but again, in the 21st century, I don't think it's necessarily possible to suppress information that way anymore. So eventually word will get around that the government was killing civilians, and we'll see if that generates any sort of backlash against the government. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.